Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on biomedical instrumentation. In this week, so far, we looked at various topics. We started out with the electrophysiology of the eye. We looked at electroretinogram. We then looked at electrooculogram. Then we looked at phonocardiogram. Then we looked at digital stethoscope. So, and we also looked at biofeedback, the electrodermal responses, BSR, basal skin resistance, and galvanic skin response. Before this, we also had a foundational anatomy physiology, very basic foundational anatomy physiology on the visual system, electrophysiology of the eye. Let us move forward to the next topic of interest. In instrumentation, a critical instrument of interest for us is the ventilator. The critical nature of ventilators became extraordinarily apparent during the COVID pandemic. So, we will spend a considerable amount of time in understanding the physiological requirements, design considerations, and various possible designs, and discuss in good depth the ventilators. However, we may not be able to do that entire discussion in this week alone, so it might spill over to the next weeks also. But in this video, in this class, we will review basic respiratory physiology. We did discuss this in one of the previous weeks. I am unable to recall which one. We did discuss this previously at least in some depth, and we will discuss modeling of the respiratory system with a basic electrical analog, critical measures in the respiratory system, and what are the major disorders of the respiratory system, and what is the need for artificial ventilation. The human respiratory system is one of the most critical system for the human body. It's essentially a masterpiece. It's essentially an example of evolutionary engineering. It is absolutely critical for the biomedical engineer to understand the physiology in depth so that they can understand the basic dynamics, basic physiology that govern gas exchange that happens in the lungs. Because if you are going to make a device that is going to assist the lungs, you need to know what the lungs are doing, and you need to know that in good detail, because it is not merely pumping oxygen inside. It's much more than that. It's much deeper and much subtle than that. It's not merely just pump oxygen inside and then the lung will breathe. Actually, hyperoxia, having too much oxygen can also cause damage to the lungs. So, it's not merely pumping some oxygen. Ventilator is much more than that. For example, the most important function of the respiratory system is gas exchange. What are the gases exchanged? Oxygen is breathed in and carbon dioxide is let out. It essentially provides oxygen, of course, through a very complicated gas exchange mechanism that happens at the alveoli, at the deepest level of the lungs. Exchange happens between the blood and the gas. Deoxygenated blood is converted into oxygen, and this blood flows to all cells in the body, essentially providing oxygen that is required for the cells to survive. That is a different respiration, that is called a cellular respiration. Each cell also breathes. That is cellular respiration. some cells absolutely need oxygen for their survival. For example, brain cells. They cannot survive without oxygen for a long time. Otherwise, they will essentially, if there is no oxygen, they will essentially they will die and essentially cause death of the person, right. And the other function is to remove carbon dioxide, that is the process of that is produced as a byproduct of metabolic processes, right. So, another role is to maintain blood pH. Does anybody know how this is achieved? Blood pH? Well, briefly, we will just briefly discuss this. Carbon dioxide plus water essentially produces this H2CO3. What is this? This is the carbonic acid, which is essentially this pH level is maintained through acid plus bicarbonate buffer. This is what is maintaining the balance of pH. Actually, it is a deep topic. I am not doing justice to that because we have other things to discuss. I am just briefly discussing this. So, this is the method through which pH is maintained. This equilibrium between this acid bicarbonate equilibrium is essentially controlled to a large extent, controlled primarily through the amount of ventilation that is there. Hypoventilation as it would happen when the person is not able to breathe, as it used to happen in a large number of cases during COVID. Hypoventilation, what will it do? Hypoventilation will tilt this balance towards acidosis, right, towards acidosis. Essentially, it decreases pH, leading to a situation in which you have respiratory acidosis. Essentially, a dangerous situation. Hyperventilation, on the other hand, increases pH, leading to respiratory alkalosis. It's too much information I am just packing in a quick this and giving. It is a deep topic. I request you to do your own reading to understand this better. But the point is that slight shift of this balance essentially can have devastating consequences. That is exactly what we saw during the COVID pandemic, right? That people who could not, if they were able to take that ventilator for a while, they would have survived, but because of lack of ventilators, right, many people essentially suffered with hypoventilation, and their blood slowly became acid. Essentially the whole, essentially they had this respiratory acidosis situation, which means once acidosis sets in, right, it is a vicious cycle that feeds into itself, and then some of these people essentially passed away. We know this story. It's a deadly disease. The point is that we will emphasize this topic and ventilators, so we prepare ourselves, so we understand how physiology and the depth of knowledge of physiology is critical in providing an appropriate solution, right. So, gas exchange essentially happens inside the lungs, the special organ that we call as lungs, and the blood itself is the medium for gaseous transport. The blood exchange gas at the level of tissue and at the interface. Where is this happening? At the deep level, at the 23rd branch, at the alveoli. Initially, what is the diameter of the trachea, bronchi, larynx? And about in the order of centimeters, right? But alveoli are about 500 million in number, about half a billion alveoli in number. Their diameters are of the order of microns, and they share boundaries, they share walls with each other supporting, otherwise they will collapse. The dynamics of how the alveoli functions is beyond the scope of this course. So, they have a septa that they share with each other, and because of the physics, it turns out that the larger alveoli or the smaller alveoli actually collapse onto the larger alveoli. This is how the physics works. It is critical to relate both physics and physiology to understand this better. So, this is essentially the physiology of the respiratory system. The nasal cavity, essentially an conditioner for air, essentially filters out large dust particles, because there are these turbinators, right, turbinates that are used to filter out relatively larger particles. When they fail to do their job, you have cold, cough. Remember, cough is not bad by itself. Cough is a reflex that is present to throw away unwanted things from inside the lungs. So, it is a very critical reflex, it is important, except that when you have too much of it, you are not able to tolerate it. So, that is the point. So, the nasal cavity essentially is a conditioner for, is a pre-filtration system, is a first filtration system. Then you have pharynx, right. It is a shared pathway that shares both food, it is part of the food pipe as well as part of the windpipe. So, it is part of it, it carries food and also it carries the air that is required, right. Again, you know how evolution has compromised between the two, right. It has of course, sometimes you do get disturbance when food attempts to enter the respiratory system. You have disturbances, right? You have some reflexes, right. That reflex timing is about 0.5 seconds, about 500 millisecond timing. This is essentially a reflex. So, the epiglottis acts as the valve that controls this movement. Then you have larynx, multiple functions. One is it acts as the voice box. Of course, it is not just voice production, but it is the voice box. But it also contains chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors that help with the critical function of breathing. Then there is an expansion, right? Then there is a trachea, and then branching out starts, and then this branching, this is the trachea that you see here, and then there are left lung and the right lung. They are not exactly the same of each other, because what happens is the left lung will have to leave some space for the heart to be present. There is the cardiac notch that is present only in the left lung but not in the right lung. So, the right lung has a slight tad bit more capacity to perform the respiratory function than the left lung. Something to keep in mind. There are about 23 branches that not shown here in this picture. What are shown here is only like one branch, second branch, third branch. Like that, there are 23 branches that happen within the lungs, right. So, these together, this branching, what is the idea? From about centimeter diameters, you have micron diameter, and then alveoli essentially increase the surface area so that gas exchange can happen in an efficient manner. It is an excellent example of evolutionary engineering wherein suddenly the surface area increases to several thousands of square centimeters. It's a huge surface area. That is possible only because of this 23 time branching that is happening within the lungs. Again, the detailed physiology is beyond the scope of this course. Let us proceed. Again, another example of this. So, you have the deoxygenated blood coming from the pulmonary artery. Note, usually it is the artery that carries the oxygenated blood, but in this case aorta and the pulmonary artery carry the blood from the heart. Aorta carries the blood from the left ventricle, which is the oxygenated blood, and the other one is also an artery. The blood vessel carrying the blood from the right ventricle is also an artery, that is called as a pulmonary artery, and that branches out into so many capillaries, really teeny tiny capillaries that then interface and interact with this alveoli. That is where gas exchange happens. Gas exchange, how does gas exchange happen? What is the principle of gas exchange? If you recall, what is the principle of gas exchange? That is essentially the Fick's law of diffusion. What is this Fick's law? The physics of gas exchange is essentially governed by the Fick's law of diffusion, which is J is minus D times delta C divided by the distance, right, which is delta x. Now, of course, the concentration gradient is huge between the amount of oxygen that is present in the alveoli is much higher than the amount of oxygen that is present in the deoxygenated blood. So, there is a concentration gradient, but the respiratory system maximizes this efficiency by several things. One is by having a huge, humongous surface area. The order of about 70 meters squared in adult lungs. In humans, it is a huge surface area. So, thus increasing the space in which this interaction can happen. Then diffusion distance is minimized. Delta x, which is the diffusion distance, is minimized. What is the diffusion distance between the capillary and the alveoli when this exchange is happened, where that exchange is happening? About half a micron, which is really small. Concentration gradient is huge and surface area is huge, distance is very small. This is how efficiency is increased by the respiratory system, right. The concentration gradient, of course, is naturally large. That is not actually controlled by the respiratory system, but the surface area is essentially a byproduct of where where form and function relate. It is this form of the respiratory system that leads to this sort of function, something critical. In my other courses on neurophysiology, for example, I quite often discuss this relationship between form and function, or structure function relationships. In biomechanics I discuss this, in my neuroscience of human movements course I discuss this, in my course on classics and neuroscience I discuss this. Essentially everywhere our interest in biomedical engineering is to understand the relationship between structure and function and how we can come up with a relationship between the two, how compromised function can be improved by improving the structure somehow, and so on and so forth. So, biomedical engineering is all about understanding form and function or structure and function of the intact healthy physiological system and then using it as a comparative study to in the compromised system. Going a little deeper than what I thought I would. So, what happens during expiration and inspiration? Right? So, during expiration what happens? Expiration, you breathe out, right, you contract the abdominals. They say that only those who go to gym have abs. Everybody has abs except that when there is a layer of fat on top of this, your abs are not visible. All of us have abs. Note that this process can be controlled voluntarily, but can also be involuntary. That is why you are able to breathe even when you are sleeping, right? But when you are breathing in during inspiration, there is an increased vertical diameter, that is an anterior posterior, there is an increased vertical diameter both in this direction and also in the AP direction, in the forward backward direction, and then the intercostals muscles are contracted, the rib cage, you can feel that. You can keep your hand here and then breathe, and you will feel that your rib cage is elevated as you do that, right. External intercostals, both the internal intercostals and external intercostals are contracted, and the contraction of the diaphragm. Note that the ancient Indians have essentially mastered the art of breathing. Is it such a big deal? It's a huge deal. Right? So, to understand how breathing happens, how specific forms of breathing and practice of specific forms of breathing can actually improve your overall health is a huge insight that Indians came up with several thousands of years ago, something to keep in mind, that pranayama, yoga and all that, yogic breathing. What are the functions of the human respiratory system? These are some of the beautiful pictures that are generated by AI, that is my TAs used AI to generate this, but essentially they gave the input to generate this. What are the critical functions of the human respiratory system? First is gas exchange. Oxygen should enter the blood and carbon dioxide should leave the blood. Second is, we already saw this, regulation of pH. How does this happen? By essentially maintaining blood acidity level by managing the carbon dioxide level, because if there is hypoventilation, carbon dioxide level is going to go up and carbonic acid is going to keep building up, essentially leading to respiratory acidosis. And of course, voice is produced by movement of air through vocal cords, that is another one. And then olfaction. It's a function, it's a sensory modality that is not given the due importance that it deserves. In animals, for example, olfaction is a huge sensory system, for example, dogs, elephants, and in humans also there is a considerable amount of critical importance for olfaction. For example, it determines to a large extent taste. What you feel at the brain, how tasty food is a function of not just the taste, not just the chemical sense of what you feel in the tongue, but also the smell. So, the flavor is also important. So, that is another function that is performed, but the primary function is of course these two for us, for our interest, because we are interested in ventilators. We are interested in building ventilators and how our knowledge of respiratory system can help us build ventilators, right. So, here is an electrical analog model of the human respiratory system. In this case, what are the comparable elements? Let us first define these. First is pressure. In the electrical system, that is, let me rewrite the whole thing in the respiratory system. In the electrical analog, the electrical model, pressure is comparable to voltage. If pressure is comparable to voltage, then what is comparable to current? Flow, is it not? this is current. It's quite challenging to write in this, right? That is flow. There is resistance to flow. There is resistance to the flow of air, that is essentially equivalent to the electrical resistance. And then what else? There is in electrical equivalent, there are these capacitances. That is comparable to the compliance of the system, right? And then there may be inductance. This is comparable to the so called inertance of the system. Now, the alveolar hydrostatic pressure at the airway opening, this is a hydrostatic pressure at the airway opening, and Pa is the pressure at the alveolus. This is the alveolar pressure, whereas the pleural pressure is the pressure inside the lungs. This is the PPL. The pressure in the lungs different from the alveolar pressure. Okay. So, the difference in the pressure delta P mus is essentially the representation is the pressure that would essentially is the average force per unit area, essentially the pressure on the chest wall that would cause the movements produced by the active contraction of the respiratory muscles during breathing, is the difference of the muscle pressure. Okay. Then PBS is essentially the hydrostatic pressure acting on the surface of the body. So, surface is a ground more like, except at the airway opening, everywhere else. So, the hydrostatic pressure that you are feeling on the surface of the body. Note that this will vary depending on where you are, and for example, if you are in water, it will vary obviously. Q essentially is a flow, QAWO, that is this is a flow, it is a gas flow rate at the airway opening at the nasal cavity, for example. VL is the volume of gas in the system, and airway resistance itself can be modeled as a resistance R airway, and the compliance, the capacitances are essentially static compliance of the lungs and the static compliance of the chest wall. All these are essentially series capacitances. So, this is a relatively simple electrical analog for this, that will help us understand how air flow happens within the lungs. Of course, we saw this in one of the previous lectures, I am unable to recall which one. Essentially, there are this tidal volume, residual volume, capacities and volumes, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, tidal volume and residual volumes are the volumes, inspiratory capacity and functional residual capacity, and vital capacity and residual volume, that is essentially the presenting the total lung capacity. We have discussed this in one of the previous classes. My TS will tell you which class it is and provide you the details, because I do not want to repeat this one more time, but recall that this is something that we have discussed, right. I think in the spirometer class, we did discuss, or just before the spirometer class, we did discuss this in some brief amount of detail. My TS will send you the link of that video, so you can review this one more time. So, there are volumes and then there are capacities, okay. Remember that, and the relationships between these volumes and capacities is also something that we discussed in that previous class. Please do check it. Okay. What are the major disorders of the respiratory system? One is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a disorder. Tuberculosis is another disorder. Chronic or allergic bronchitis and asthma, these are the major disorders of the respiratory system that can affect the performance of the respiratory system. Of course, the entire the integrity of the entire system, starting with the nasal cavity till the alveolus. Anywhere if there is a compromise, there is going to be a huge compromise everywhere else. Remember, the initial conditions matter. Everywhere this matters. So, which is why starting with the nasal cavity, the size of your turbinates, the size of the manner in which air flows between the two left and the right nostrils, all these things matter. Actually, they matter quite a bit, because if air flow through one of the two nostrils is laminar, the other one is not laminar, the other one is turbulent, it will create an imbalance that can cause quite a bit of discomfort, especially when there is an allergy, causing this common allergic rhinitis problem or sinusitis, rhinitis, sinusitis, and all these are problems that happen at the level of the nostrils itself. So, the shape, the size of the nostrils, the size of the nasal cavity and the turbinates, and the differences, imbalances, all these things could cause a huge effect on the quality of life of people, quality of sleep, essentially the quality of whole life. It's not a trivial topic, which is why learning how to breathe, as I am saying this, I am laughing at myself saying this, and I think some of you are also laughing. Oh, do we have to learn how to breathe? The answer is yes, we all have to learn how to breathe. It turns out that there is a particular way of breathing that will essentially remove the possibility of some of these problems, or prevent some of these avoidable problems from happening. That is yogic breathing. Right. What is the need for artificial ventilation? Essentially, the purpose is to provide an adequate amount of oxygen to the participant who needs, to the patient who needs the oxygen. The main function of the respiratory system is to provide the required amount of oxygen and remove carbon dioxide, removes the carbon dioxide. But in some cases, the system may not be able to fully function. Remember, it is not that it is completely dysfunctional, but rather it is not able to do its job, fulfill the full demand. In such conditions, there is a need to provide artificial support. This is only needed until the system regains its original function, because the system is also constantly repairing itself. Until the original respiratory system comes back to form, you need to provide ventilation. After that, the person can breathe on their own. So, ventilator support is only needed for some time in many of these cases. Not especially during COVID, ventilator support was not needed for throughout. Only for some patients it was needed, but some patients needed ventilator support only for some time until they recovered. Once they recover, they are back on their own, they can still survive. So, we already discussed this. So, essentially the delta P muscular is the major source of pressure. So, you can, through the difference in muscle pressure is what is causing the breathing. This pressure is affected during some surgical procedures, or due to anesthesia, or due to some other pathological conditions. For example, breathing problems, fever, cold, other diseases, and in extreme forms COVID type of diseases. And this process of artificial ventilation essentially provides the adequate amount of oxygen, adequate amount of air and oxygen to the person. Critically, it is important to note that it is not that ventilators are essentially oxygen pumps. Most ventilators essentially provide support to the existing function. It is not that they are a replacement for the heart, replacement for the lungs. They are not a replacement for the lungs, but rather they provide support to the lungs. That means you first need to know what the lung is doing. Only when you know what the lung is doing, or what the current condition of the lung is, you can then provide an appropriate support. So, it is not a one size fits all solution. You need to know what the current condition, which is why I think the modern development of AI based tailored therapy, patient specific or targeted therapy, that Those who need how much ventilation, they are provided only that much ventilation, but not more or less. This is absolutely critical. So, only when you have an understanding of what the system current condition of the patient is, you can provide an appropriate solution. This adaptive technology is an absolute need in ventilation systems, ventilator systems. So, some things to keep in mind with regard to ventilators. You need to have an excellent system integration, because you see the natural lungs are an excellent example of system integration happening at multiple levels. The respiratory system exemplifies how complex biological processes are essentially interacting with the physics of simple physics of gas exchange. For example, what is the law that is controlling gas exchange? Essentially it boils down to high school physics, is it not? P1 V1 is P2 V2 type of laws. These are quite basic, but biological processes in the respiratory system balances that at multiple feedback, using multiple feedback loops. That is an excellent example of system integration as biomedical engineers, something that we can pick up. That is one. Two is design philosophy, right? Nature optimizes efficiency. How efficiency is optimized by nature? I will leave this as an exercise for you, but I will give you a clue. Murray's law. Check what this is with regard to the respiratory system. What is Murray's law? Check that. And redundancy, because you have redundancy, or the correct word is actually abundance. You have collateral ventilation, that is possible. Collateral ventilation, that is possible. Nature also provides this collateral ventilation. Then adaptability over a wide range of operation, is it not? Wide operating range, something that is quite challenging in the instruments that we make in the medical devices. A common problem is the dynamic range that we need. That is because within a small range of operation our systems will function excellent, but in the physiological range of operations sometimes our systems are going to find it quite challenging. So, that is the other one. And critically there are engineering challenges, right? Your artificial ventilation must still respect the physiological processes and the gas exchange principles. It is not like your artificial ventilator is simply pumping in gas. It is much more than that. It has to still respect the physiological principles and conform to the integrity of the overall respiratory system. So, there is quite a bit of opportunity for innovation in this, including biomimetic designs, tailored therapy, patient specific therapy, and so on and so forth. We will discuss all this in excellent detail in future videos. With this, we will end this video. In this video, we looked at basic respiratory physiology, modeling of the respiratory system using an electrical analog. What are the critical measures in the respiratory system? A review. We saw this in the spirometer video. I will ask my TA to post the original video link, because I did not go into this in detail. The volumes and capacities slide, I did not go into this in detail in this video, but I have done that in the previous video. And the disorders of the respiratory system, what is the need for artificial ventilation, and what are some of the things that the physiological system does that we will have to do using artificial ventilation. With this, we come to the end of this video, and we will look into ventilators in great detail in the future videos. In excellent detail, we will deep dive into ventilators in the future videos. With this, we end this video. Thank you very much for your attention.